Here's the story you've heard. South Africa kicked out its white farmers, the farms collapsed, and now the nation starves. It's everywhere. It's on cable news, it's written into executive orders, crosses planted along a country road, each one supposedly marking a murdered farmer. Charter flights of white refugees landing in America. A government, the story goes, that seized the land, drove out the people who grew the food, and then stood back while its own country slid toward famine. It's one of the most viral political narratives of the decade, and almost none of it is true. The farms didn't collapse. They just posted the best year in their history. The white farmers weren't driven out. They still own most of the country's farmland. And the hunger, which is painfully, undeniably real, has almost nothing to do with the story being sold to the world. But here's the part that nobody wants to say out loud, because the truth is worse. Because while the world argues about a crisis that isn't really happening, a real one is unfolding in plain sight. And the people responsible would much rather you keep watching the wrong movie. So let's start with the collapse, because if a country's farms have truly collapsed, you'd expect to see it somewhere. Empty silos, failed harvests, ships full of imported grain pulling into port just to keep people fed. But South Africa, well, they show the exact opposite. In 2025, the country's agricultural exports hit a record of around $15.1 billion. That's billion with a B, roughly up 10% on the year before. Grapes, maize, citrus, wine, nuts, apples, sugar, berries, all of them shipped out by the millions of tons. That's not the balance sheet of a dying industry. That's a record-breaking one. And it gets sharper than one good year. South Africa pulled this off while clawing back from one of its worst droughts in recent memory. The dry spell of 2024 hammered yields, and the sector still came roaring back the very next season. A farming industry that is collapsing, well, it doesn't shrug off a drought and then smash its own export record. It buckles. But South Africa did the exact opposite. And then you have the staple crop, maize. The 2024 to 2025 harvest came in at over 16 million tons, about 27% higher than the previous season. South Africa needs somewhere around 12 million tons to feed itself. It grew several million more than that, and they exported the surplus. And here's a detail that should stop the whole narrative cold. Some of that South African maize went north to help feed Zimbabwe, the very country that this story keeps invoking as South Africa's terrifying future. Let's sit with that for a moment. The nation, supposedly starving because its farms collapsed, grew so much food that it has leftovers to feed its neighbors. Well, the agriculture sector posted double-digit growth across 2025. So whatever's breaking in South Africa, it's not the farms. So if the farms are thriving, where on earth did that "they kicked out the white farmers" come from? Well, it came from a law, and how the law was sold. On January 23, 2025, President Cyril Ramaphosa signed the Expropriation Act. It replaced a version dating back to 1975 from the apartheid era, and it carried one provision that lit the fuse. In certain narrow cases, the state could take land and pay nothing for it. Nil compensation, in the legal language, for land that's abandoned, purely held to speculate on rising value, or owned by the state itself and left sitting unused. To critics abroad, that single clause became the entire story. Confiscation, seizure, a government coming for white-owned farms. But here's what the headlines left out. By the middle of 2025, not a single farm had been taken under the law without compensation. Not one. The law itself hadn't even been fully switched on months after Ramaphosa signed it. It still hadn't been published in the government's official gazette, the step required to bring it into force. And Agri-SA, the country's main commercial farming organization, the people who would scream loudest if their members were being dispossessed, said it flatly. No seizures, no confiscations, no land expropriated without compensation. Isolated land grabs and trespassing, that was dealt with. But a wave of state seizures, well, that never came. And the bigger picture demolishes the narrative completely. As of 2025, white commercial farmers, roughly 44,000 farming operations, still owned around 61 million hectares of land. That worked out to be about 78% of all farmland in South Africa that comes with a private title deed. 3 decades after apartheid ended, after every land reform program, every political promise, every furious speech. 78%. You don't arrive at 78% ownership while being kicked out. And the man overseeing South Africa's ag department through much of this period, well, he's white. The narrative insists a government is purging its white farmers, but the reality is a government that left the overwhelming majority of farmland exactly where it found it. And inside South Africa, the law is so contested that it barely moved. The Democratic Alliance, the second largest party, and a partner in the very coalition government that passed the act after the 2024 election, marched into court in February of 2025 to challenge it as unconstitutional, calling parts of it vague and contradictory. The coalition itself is split down the middle. One bloc defends property rights and pushes funding and skill support for new farmers, and another faction demands redistribution that's far faster and far harder. The result, as you can guess, is gridlock. The act sits on the statute books as a political weapon that nobody actually fired, which makes the panic overseas even stranger. The world declared the seizures a catastrophe, while South Africa's own parliament was still arguing about whether the law could even survive a courtroom. But something real was happening on those rural roads, and waving it away would be its own kind of lie. Farm attacks are real. Let's not pretend otherwise for a second. Living on an isolated farm in a country with one of the highest violent crime rates on Earth, that's genuinely dangerous. Families have been tied up, beaten, killed even in their own homes. The terror in those communities, that's not invented. Those crosses along the roadside, they stood for real people who really died, and their families will carry that forever. But the leap from tragedy to a genocide, well, that's a numbers question. And the numbers refuse to say what the narrative needs them to. In the 2024 to 2025 reporting year, South Africa reported over 25,000 murders. That's a brutal figure. That's roughly 69 people killed every single day. Of those 25,000, the number that occurred on farms and small holdings was 358. And of those 358, the number involving the actual farming community came to around 42. Just 42 out of more than 25,000. That's a fraction of 1%. And when South Africa's police minister broke one recent quarter down by race because the global pressure had forced the question into parliament, the farm owners that were murdered in that quarter, they were black, not white. Investigators have said for years that the motive in the vast majority of farm attacks is robbery, not race. No credible inquiry has ever found an organized campaign to wipe out white farmers as a group. Now, that doesn't mean that the state is doing right by these communities. Far from it. A farmers group study of attack cases found that under 20% ever ended in a conviction. And the police's ability to solve murders nationwide, that's cratered over the past decade. Rural families have every reason to feel unprotected, but the police are failing isolated communities. That's a very different statement from the government is exterminating a race. The first, it's true and damning, but the second is the fiction that the world bought. So here's what we actually have. You have a country whose farms are breaking export records, a government that left most farmland in white hands, and farm murders that are a tiny sliver of a horrifying nationwide crime wave that kills people of every color. And yet millions of South Africans really are going hungry. So if the farms are fine and the seizures never happened, then how? How does a record harvest end with empty plates? That contradiction is the real story, and it's the one that almost nobody is willing to tell. The hunger's not a rumor, it's measured, and it's getting worse. By late 2025, South Africa's own presidency admitted that somewhere between 15 and 16 million people in the country had inadequate or severely inadequate access to food. The National Statistics Agency tracked households facing moderate to severe food insecurity, climbing from about 16% in 2019 to nearly 20% by 2023. Almost 11 million people now live below the official food poverty line, scraping by on the equivalent of less than $2 a day for food. The United Nations estimates the share of undernourished South Africans roughly tripled between 2006 and 2024, and close to 1 in 3 children under the age of 5 now shows stunted growth, the kind of damage caused by early malnutrition that the body never fully repairs. This is a food emergency, a slow, grinding, generational one. It's exactly the kind of suffering that the viral narrative claims to be describing. And the cost lands hardest on the people least equipped to carry it. Almost 11 million South Africans live beneath the food poverty line, scraping through on roughly 28 rand a day for food. That's less than the price of a single fast food meal. The country's health department records on the order of 1,000 child deaths from malnutrition every year. Close to 29% of children under 5 are stunted, so their bodies and minds are permanently marked by hunger before they ever even sit in a classroom. These aren't abstractions on a chart. This is what a food emergency looks like at the level of one kitchen table, repeated millions of times across the country. But watch what happens when you set the two facts down side by side. Record harvests, record food exports, a maize surplus large enough to feed other countries, and 15 million people who can't reliably eat. Both are true at the very same time, in the very same country. Well, that's not what farming collapse looks like. A farming collapse, well, that means there's no food. South Africa is drowning in food. It ships billions of dollars of it overseas every year. The shelves are stocked. The trucks are running. The problem was never that the food doesn't exist. The problem is that millions of people cannot afford to buy it. And the moment you understand that, the entire white farmers story, well, it falls apart in your hands. And a far more uncomfortable one steps into its place. Because there's a piece of South African agriculture that genuinely did fail. But it's not the piece that you've been shown. For 30 years, South Africa has tried to undo the land theft of apartheid through land reform, buying or transferring farmland and then handing it to black South Africans who were violently stripped of it under white rule. The goal was just, but the execution, disastrous. The original target, set back in the 1990s, was to redistribute 30% of the country's agricultural land. 3 decades on, and South Africa has reached only about a quarter of that goal. Not a quarter of the land, just a quarter of the target. And the farms that were transferred, well, study after study tells the same grim story. National reviews estimate that fewer than 15% of redistributed farms operate at full commercial potential. One major academic review put the share of underperforming or underused transferred farms somewhere between 70 and 90%. A flagship government program meant to support hand-picked beneficiary farms recorded a failure rate of around 75%. On land reform farms in surveyed provinces, crop production fell by nearly 80% after the handover. Jobs on those same farms dropped by more than 80%. Land handed over, and then it stopped producing food. But why? Not because the new owners were incapable. That's a lazy and quite ugly answer that the narrative is desperate for you to reach. The real reason is that the government gave people land and then abandoned them on it. No working capital, no equipment, no training, no access to bank credit, because lenders won't finance a title that the state has signaled it might one day void. No irrigation support, no logistics, no markets. The state spent billions buying farms, but almost nothing to keep them alive afterward. And a large share of even that money disappeared into administration and the wrong pockets long before it reached a single field. Land, it turns out, is the easy part. A farm is not just dirt. It's expertise, machinery, finance, fuel, logistics, and 1,000 small decisions made correctly every single season. You strip those away, and the most fertile soil on the continent grows nothing but weeds. You can watch the sequence repeat the same way every time. A farm changes hands. The new owner gets no bridging finance, no money for seed, fertilizer, no diesel. An irrigation pivot breaks down and there's nothing to repair it with. Equipment gets stripped and sold for scrap. Within a season or two, a property that once trucked food to market is producing barely enough to feed one household, if that. Multiply that by hundreds of transfers and you've described a redistribution program that moved the land without moving a single one of the things that actually make the land produce food. Now that is the failure that's real. And notice who owns it. It's not a race, not the farmers who emigrated. A government that could not execute its own program. But here's a twist that ties the whole thing together. Even that failure, the collapse of the redistributed farms, that's not what caused the hunger. It couldn't have. Those failed farms were never feeding the nation in the first place. The commercial sector that survived, the one that's posting record exports, still grows the overwhelming majority of South Africa's food. The country stayed fed in spite of the land reform catastrophe, not because of it. South Africa runs, in effect, on two separate agricultures. A world-class commercial machine that feeds the nation and the export market, and a struggling, under-supported smallholder world that politics has spent 30 years promising to lift and failing to. So the hunger flows from somewhere else entirely. It flows from the thing that politicians find hardest to fix, because you can't solve it with a slogan or a seizure. Poverty. South Africa carries one of the highest unemployment rates on the planet, by a broad measure that counts people who've given up looking. More than 40% of working-age South Africans have no job. The World Bank ranks it as the most unequal country on Earth. When a third or more of your population has no income at all, well, it doesn't matter how full the supermarket shelves are. Food that exists but cannot be bought may as well just not exist. Then, stack on top of that the food price inflation that is chewed through wages already stretched to breaking. A long supply chain where every middleman adds a markup between the farm gate and the till. Years of rolling power blackouts that drove up costs of producing and moving everything. This is a country exporting $15 billion of food while millions of its own citizens count out coins and ration what's on the plate. This is a real crisis, and it's an indictment, but of the right target. Not of the farmers who grow the food, not of the color of anyone's skin, but it indicts a political and economic system that manufactures abundance but then can't deliver to its own people. And look, this isn't some outside critic spin. South Africa's own presidential envoy on agriculture, the economist who tracks these exact numbers for a living, said it in plain language. The country is a leading food exporter, food secure as a nation, while millions of its households are not. He even wrote a book about the divide titled A Country of Two Agricultures. One, South Africa runs vast, mechanized, globally competitive farms that fill container ships bound for Europe and Asia. And the other, well, it's millions of families who can see the food stacked on the shelf, but can't reach it. Because the tragedy was never that the country couldn't grow enough food, it's that growing enough was never the problem. And the people in charge have spent years pretending that it was. So how did this, a story about poverty, unemployment, and a botched government program, get rebuilt into a global tale of white genocide and stolen farms? Well, that's where it gets dark, because someone benefited from that lie. And if this is the first time that anyone walked you through what the numbers actually say, be sure to take a second to subscribe to Fall of Nations, because what comes next is the part that turns a convenient misunderstanding into something that looks a great deal more deliberate. The moment a struggling country's homegrown failure got picked up, repackaged, and weaponized by the most powerful government on Earth. Now, to understand why, you have to understand the ghost that's haunting this entire debate: Zimbabwe. Now, just across South Africa's northern border, in the early 2000s, the government of Robert Mugabe did the thing that South Africa's critics fear is coming next. It seized thousands of white-owned commercial farms. Fast, violent, and without compensation. The result was precisely the nightmare that the South African narrative describes. Zimbabwe's maize output crashed from around 1.8 million tons a year to a fraction of that within just a few seasons. A regional breadbasket turned into a country that's surviving on international food aid. Hyperinflation followed. So extreme, the government ended up printing $100 trillion banknotes. Not kidding. Now, at its peak, in 2008, more than 5 million Zimbabweans, roughly 40% of the population, leaned on emergency food handouts just to survive. Tobacco and horticulture exports, once the country's lifeblood of foreign currency, simply evaporated. But notice what didn't change. The land was still there, the rivers were still there, the climate was still there. But what vanished was the dense web of know-how, machinery, seed supply, finance, and veterinary services that were built up on those commercial farms over generations. And once it was torn out, no decree could will it back into existence. South African farmers watched that collapse play out on their own border for 20 years. It's the cautionary tale that they reach for more than any other. And Zimbabwe is a genuine warning. It proves the underlying point beyond argument. Tear expertise and capital out of agriculture overnight, and the food stops. That's actually what happened to a real country within living memory. And this is exactly why the lie about South Africa works so well. It borrows Zimbabwe's very real horror and staples it onto a country where the seizures never came. The fear's authentic. The application is false. South Africa stared straight at Zimbabwe's collapse and, for all its government failures, at least did not repeat it. At least not yet. The commercial farms are still standing. The maize is still flowing across the border. That's the wrong way for the narrative. The catastrophe got transplanted from a country where it happened to a country that didn't. But fear is useful. Fear can travel. Fear raises money. It can win elections. And it reshapes foreign policy. And by 2025, that fear had taken on a life of its own. Fringe websites spent years logging every farm attack as proof of an extermination campaign. Lobby groups raised funds off the dread. Clips of a populist opposition firebrand chanting an old apartheid struggle song, one that includes the words, "Kill the Boer," ricocheted around the world, stripped of context and presented as official government policy. But that's not an official policy. The politician leading those chants heads a party that has never sat in government. But online, nuances die, and the most frightening version wins. A grim but ordinary crime problem, a slow-motion policy failure, and a single inflammatory song all got blended into one terrifying story. A nation hunting its white farmers toward extinction. And then, the most powerful office on the planet decided to pick it up. What Washington did next turned a convenient misunderstanding into something that looked a great deal more deliberate. Because on February 7th of 2025, the President of the United States made South Africa's lie his official policy. Donald Trump signed an executive order. It cut off aid to South Africa, and it offered something extraordinary: refugee status, fast-tracked for white South Africans, Afrikaners, whom the order described as victims of racial persecution and a government coming to take their land. Refugee status, the same designation that the U.S. reserves for people fleeing war zones and actual genocide, handed to citizens of a peaceful, food-exporting democracy where, by every official measure that exists, no campaign of persecution was taking place. Well, the machinery moved quickly. In May 2025, the first group of around 59 Afrikaners landed on American soil as refugees. More followed, and by the spring of 2026, roughly 6,500 South Africans had been resettled. But here's a detail that exposes the entire operation. On his first day back in office, Donald Trump had frozen the whole U.S. refugee program, slamming the door on people fleeing real wars across dozens of countries, and then he cut exactly one exception into it. So across that stretch, the overwhelming majority of every refugee admitted to the U.S., a program that for decades had taken in the desperate from war-torn nations from the world over, were white South Africans, from a country that was not at war and was not committing a genocide. In a tense meeting in the Oval Office in May 2025, Trump confronted President Ramaphosa directly, rolling footage of the roadside crosses and farm murder clips, calling it genocide to the man's face. Ramaphosa denied it. South Africa's own crime statistics and fact-checkers around the world, well, they backed the denial. And then came a twist that was almost too neat to be real. Some of those resettled refugees, people who had supposedly fled a country trying to exterminate them, started going home. A family resettled in Florida. Others who had arrived and quietly made their way back to South Africa. People do not move back after a genocide. The story had grown so powerful that it could pick up thousands of human beings and move them across the planet. And it still wasn't true. And the lie is not free. It cost South Africa in ways that have nothing to do with whether a single farm was ever seized. The executive order didn't just dangle refuge. It cut off United States aid and dragged South Africa into Washington's crosshairs. Around 2025, the U.S. piled steep tariffs onto South African goods. And by the final quarter of the year, South African farm exports to America had dropped sharply, around 39% year on year, as citrus, wine, and nuts slammed into new trade walls. A narrative built on a fiction had generated very real economic pain for the exact farmers that it claimed to be rescuing. And then you have the quieter damage, the fear itself. Not any seizure, but the fear. Unsettled investors and lenders, banks that turn cautious about financing farmland whose ownership a law might one day cloud. Analysts warned that the uncertainty alone could chill investment in a sector that had just posted record numbers. None of it required a single farm to actually change hands. The story by itself was enough to push up the cost of doing business across South African agriculture. So the cruelest irony lands right here. A campaign waged in the name of saving South Africa's farmers ended up taxing their exports, spooking their financiers, and poisoning their country's name abroad, all to battle a confiscation that never happened. So strip it all away. The crosses, the refugee flights, executive orders, the viral clips and cable news panels. And what's actually left standing? A country that grows far more food than it needs and breaks export records doing it. A government that left most of the farmland in the same hands that already held it. A land reform program that genuinely failed. Not because the wrong people received the land, but because the state that handed it over then walked away and let those farms die. And 15 million people going hungry in the middle of all that abundance for the oldest reason in human history. They're too poor to buy what their own country produces in surplus. The farms didn't collapse. They had their best year on record. Nobody drove the white farmers off the land. They still hold most of it. And the country is not going hungry because someone got kicked out of a field. The country is hungry because its leaders built one of the most productive farming sectors on the continent, and then failed utterly to turn that abundance into a fed population. That's not a race war. It's a governance failure. And governance failures don't make gripping thumbnails, which is the entire reason the world got handed a different story. Land can change hands in an afternoon, but competence cannot. And a harvest does not care about slogans, executive orders, or what's trending in another hemisphere. It answers to one question only. Did the work get done? And that's the line that should haunt everyone who repeated the easy version. The food got grown. The harvest came in. Ships even got loaded. Every part of the chain that runs on competence and capital and hard agriculture know-how, well, that worked. Worked well enough to set records. But the part that failed was the part that runs on governance, turning a rich harvest into full plates for poor citizens, actually supporting the new farmers that the country swore it would lift, and then telling its own people the truth instead of letting the world invent a scarier story in the silence. Those are political failures. Human-made, fixable. And nobody fixes a problem that they've successfully disguised as someone else's race war. South Africa grew the food. It simply could not get it onto its own people's plates. And no amount of pointing at white farmers will move the truth 1 inch. Because the machine that's actually breaking South Africa, it was never out in the fields. It's inside the buildings where the decisions get made. So now we want to hear from you. If a story this big can be this wrong, repeated by presidents, printed in headlines, used to move thousands of people across the world, what else are we all being told that simply doesn't survive a look at the numbers? Was this a genuine misunderstanding that spiraled, or was this manufactured from the start by people who knew better? Be sure to drop your take in the comments, because we read all of them. And if you want more breakdowns that follow the evidence instead of the outrage, be sure to subscribe to Fall of Nations. Because the next collapse that everybody's shouting about, it might not be happening either.